In our last lecture, we looked at the rationalist philosophers, and in this lecture, we're going to be looking at the empiricists. And remember, as we look at this main divide between two schools of thought, the rationalists versus the empiricists, both of these schools of thought are focusing primarily on epistemology. So in the last lecture, I mentioned this Copernican shift that happened in philosophy, where we moved away from putting metaphysics at the center of philosophy to where now I think there's more of this emphasis of putting epistemology at the center of philosophy. And that is central in the way that we think about these two schools. They're both trying to come up with a justification for the things that they say that they believe. Now, the key thinkers when it comes to the empiricists are John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume. And we'll look at each of these thinkers, but first, I think it would be helpful to make distinctions between three kinds of empiricism. So there is one type of empiricism that might be called direct realism. Sometimes it's called common sense realism or naive realism. But this position says that the immediate object of our perception is a physical object that exists independently of our awareness of it. So what we perceive to be the object, that perception is really lining up almost identically with the object that we're perceiving. So there's almost a one-to-one correspondence between our perceptions and the way the physical objects actually are. The representationalist view is distinct from this in that it says that physical objects really do exist and they really do give rise to the sense data that we have in our perceptions, but we only have immediate knowledge of the things that we're perceiving. In other words, our perceptions represent the objects that we're perceiving, but there's not a direct one-to-one correspondence between the two. And the last kind of empiricism that we're going to be looking at is phenomenalism, which actually says that the physical objects that we perceive are actually constructions of sense data themselves, and they do not exist independently of sense impressions, which this is the view that is represented by George Berkeley, and we'll look at that here in a moment. But let's start with direct realism or naive realism. This one has been critiqued a lot, and there's very few philosophers that actually hold to this kind of empiricism. I think Bertrand Russell gives perhaps the best critique of naive realism, where he says that naive realism leads to physics, at least that's the hope, is that we want to believe in physics, and so we're just going to assume that our perceptions of the physical world has this one-to-one correspondence. But he goes on to say that physics, if it's true, and we assume that it's true, it actually shows us that naive realism is false, and therefore naive realism must be false, therefore it is false. Well, what does he mean by this? Well, he's thinking about things like color. So we perceive color all around us, but what we know from physics is that color, the colors that we perceive are not in the physical objects themselves, but they're just transferred to us through our sense experience as color, but they don't exist in the physical objects themselves. Or the fact that we see distant stars. So when we're looking at distant stars, we think we're seeing the physical objects as they are, but in reality, what we're doing is we're looking at stars as they used to be billions of years ago. So the sunlight or the starlight that appears to us now is really giving us a history of what happened billions of years ago and not really what's going on right now. Or the motions of our planets. There are many things that we perceive to be the case, but that doesn't necessarily lead to a one-to-one correspondence. So we perceive that the sun rises, but of course that's not what's happening. And so what we learn from physics and from the sciences is that direct realism is not true. There's not a one-to-one correspondence between our perceptions and the way that the world actually is. Well, if these examples don't convince you, we can do just two really simple experiments to show how our perceptions frequently or very easily can be tricked, and therefore there's not an obvious one-to-one correspondence between the things that we're perceiving and our perceptions themselves. So consider the 4 squares that are on your screen. So there are 2 big squares, 2 small squares, if you look at the small square on the left and you compare that small square with the small square on the right, most people will say that the small square on the left appears to be more blue than the small square on the right. And in fact, if you look at the small square on the right, that almost looks to be gray, where if you look at the small square on the left, that one is more blue. Now, not everyone sees this, but by and large, and for the most part, when you do this experiment with, say, a room full of people, people will say that the small square on the left appears to be blue, at least more blue than the small square on the right. But of course, if you cover up the bigger squares, and then you look at the squares next to each other, then it appears that the squares are the same exact color. Well, what does this show? Well, this provides a critique of direct realism, because again, if there's a one-to-one correspondence to the way that we're perceiving things in our head and the way that things actually are, well, what do we do with experiments like this? Or another fun illusion that you can do that's similar is the picture that you have on your screen now. If you look at the dot in the center of this image, and then you try to look at, just focus on that center dot, and then you ask, does it appear that there is motion? Do the circles around it appear to be moving in circles? Well, if you say yes, it appears that they're moving. And again, not everyone sees this, but if you stare long enough at the center dot, usually you will see it. If you say yes, it appears that there's motion happening, well, that's an illusion, because this image is not moving, it's completely still, and so again, that's another critique of direct realism. It shows how easy our perceptions can be deceived. And so we move then to representationalism, which is a better form of empiricism. So this position, again, says that physical objects really do exist. So there are things that exist outside of our sense perception, and they really do give rise to the sense data inside our perceptions. But what we have is mediate knowledge between the two. Now, John Locke, when he talked about this, he talked about the distinction between primary and secondary qualities. So the real world that we see, so say we're perceiving a tree, that tree really does exist, and it really is causing our perception of the tree. But what we won't say is that our perception of the tree is an exact correspondence. Our perceptions represent the tree that actually exists out there in the real world, but it doesn't represent it perfectly. Now, the way that John Locke talked about this is he said that sense experience is the source of all ideas and all knowledge. And before we have any empirical experience of the world, we're actually blank slates, tabula rasa. So we're blank slates from birth, and so any knowledge that we have after that is simply coming through the senses. Now this leads to several conclusions that most empiricists hold on to, such as knowledge is fallible. So if our perceptions are just representing the world around us, we're not going to claim that our perceptions are perfect. They're fallible. We can make mistakes. We can perceive things wrongly, as we saw with our experiments when we were looking at direct realism. And it also follows that, therefore, our knowledge is probabilistic. So the empiricists reject, for sure Descartes' claim, but most of the rationalist claim where we're trying to, in rationalism, develop deductive certain arguments for conclusions that we hold. The empiricist says we don't need certain knowledge. What we want is probabilistic knowledge. We can say that such and such is probably the case, but we're not saying it's certainly the case. The empiricist wants to emphasize the third person objective knowledge over first person subjective knowledge. And again, this makes the distinction between the rationalist and the empiricist. If you're starting with empirical observation, you're starting with the objects out there. If you're starting with what I can prove rationally, you're starting with the subject. Empiricists say, let's start with the third person. So again, rationalists say, let's just sit and think about it. Empiricists say, go and see. So how does this work? Well, for John Locke, the objects that exist out there cause experiences in our senses, and so you have insensible light particles that go into, say, the cornea of our eye, back to the optic nerve, and sends electrical signals to our brain. All of that is the sense organs. And then you have a brain event that happens that actually transforms all of this physical cause and effect. So when the light particles hit, say, the cones and rods in our eyes and create that electrical signal that sends information back to our visual cortex in the back of our brain, all of that is physical cause and effect. It's physics. But then Locke says that there's a transformation that happens while the brain event is happening that transforms the physical to the mental. And that's how you have a perceptual experience. So physics gives rise to mental events, according to Locke. Now he is interestingly a dualist, just like Descartes was a dualist. He says when it comes to the material physical world, we want to study it using what we know from science. Now the science of his day was the science of Newtonian physics. So there's very simple cause and effect relationships that happen between objects, and those objects go all the way through the insensible light that goes into our organs. All of that is physics, and we can understand that cause and effect. But when it comes to our mental world, and he would say this is actually where faith comes in. So again, the faith and reason thing is coming up throughout the history of philosophy. But this is where faith comes in, that we also have this mental world that is free, where I can think over things, and that is something that exists completely independently of the physical brain and the physical world. And yet, it is the physical world that gives rise to the sense perceptions that we have. Now, George Berkeley, who is another empiricist, disagreed with John Locke on this dualistic way of looking at the world, and he had a very simple question. How could a material reality cause an immaterial reality? In other words, if you're saying that it's physics all the way down until you have a sense perception, and that sense perception is just a non-physical, mental perception, well, how does the material give rise to the immaterial? And Berkeley says there's no answer to this problem, and so he disagrees with the representationalist point of view, and instead he is a monist. But he's not a material monist. So he said a material monist is somebody who says that all that exists is the material physical world, and everything can be understood according to Newtonian physics, at least during this day, according to Newtonian physics. And everything can be understood at that level, and even our brain can be understood at that level, even the sense perceptions themselves. He said if that's true, well then how can we trust that our thoughts are reliable when they're just reduced to Newtonian physics? So Berkeley rejects this view. This will actually be the view that David Hume adopts. So David Hume is material monist. George Berkeley, on the other hand, says this is false and instead argues for phenomenalism, which says that physical objects are constructions of sense data, but they don't exist independent of those sense perceptions or impressions. And so he's an ideal monist or an idealist monist. His famous phrase is to be perceived. And so for Berkeley, all the material objects that we see around us don't reduce to matter and motion. Instead, they reduce to the perceptions of God. We are actually looking at God's thoughts, according to Berkeley, when we look at the physical world. For him, mental realities are primary, and therefore they're not reduced to any material reality. And that's how we can have sense perceptions, according to Berkeley, that are reliable, because when we perceive, if perception is primary, what we're doing is we're perceiving God's perceptions. So the correspondence between the material world around us, or I shouldn't say material world, the ideal world around us, and our thoughts, is that our thoughts are corresponding to thoughts. Well, as I already mentioned, Berkeley rejects Hume, he rejects Newtonian physics, and he has a series of questions that you could ask the material empiricists, such as why, if you're a materialistic empiricist, would you believe in other minds? So if mind, if Descartes' right or Locke is right, that is this immaterial part of us, well, why would you believe that on a materialistic assumption? It doesn't seem like you can. Why would you believe in moral values? Moral values seem to be the types of things that aren't reduced to objects in motion. So is there any justification for moral values? Or what about our belief in causation? And actually, as we move to Hume here in a second, this and the question of induction, so how can I be justified using inductive reasoning, which is to say, how do I know that the future will be like the past? These are questions that Berkeley brings up that David Hume is going to try to address, and they're very difficult problems. So when it comes to causation, you can see that event A happens, and then after event A happens, event B happens, but you don't observe the causal relationships between the events. And so what justification do we have in believing in causation itself? Causation seems to be this thing that we assume. So we assume necessary connections between things. We assume agent causation, but how can we really justify causation? And how can we justify induction? To understand these problems, we'll start with induction. And this is induction sort of the way that David Hume lays out the problem. So this is really a problem that Hume has made popular. Of course, Berkeley asked these same questions. For Berkeley, these problems are why he's an idealist, and what Hume is going to show is how it's very difficult to justify some of our simple intuitions on a materialistic perspective. But the problem of induction begins with this question: how do I know that the future will be like the past? So we can do a thought experiment where we have a bag that's full of hundreds and hundreds of marbles. And let's say we take this bag and we start drawing marbles out of the bag, and every marble that we've drawn out of the bag so far has been red. So we've literally drawn hundreds of marbles outside of the bed, and therefore we conclude that the next marble will probably be red. It's a safe assumption because our past experience has shown us that every time we draw a marble out of this bag, it's red. Well, there's a problem. And the problem is that there's 2 blue marbles in the bag. And so if we think about our assumption, our probabilistic assumption in terms of an argument, what we've said is that all of the marbles that I've pulled out of this bag so far have been red. Therefore, the next marble will probably be red. Well, how do we justify this argument? Well, we need another premise, which is really an assumption. And the assumption is that the future will resemble the past. But this is the very question. How do we know that the future will resemble the past? Well, if you want an argument for this and not just an assumption, then you have to move the assumption to a conclusion, and you have to develop an argument for this conclusion. So what reasons do we have to say that the future will be like the past? Well, we might say something like this. In the past, the future has always resembled the past. And so, what's our assumption? Well, our assumption is that, again, the future will resemble the past. There's a problem here. That's our conclusion. And this makes for an uncomfortable circular argument, because we want to conclude that the future will be like the past, but to make it a conclusion and not an assumption, we have to make an argument for it. But the only way that we can make an argument for this conclusion is to assume that the future will be like the past. But this is the very assumption that we're trying to make not an assumption, but make a conclusion. And this is the question that we have. How do we know that this is true? To put this in terms of a timeline, we could say that all the events that we have observed, and then we'll just add in some future events as well, are operating consistently. And so in the timeline, we have today marked, and the future is marked as being after today. So you go to the right of the timeline, that's the future. And the past is going to be everything to the left of the timeline. So the question is, how do we know that the future will be like the past? Well, when we say in the past, so when today was the past, we looked at the future, and it so happened to be the case that the future was like the past. That's how we justify that the future is going to be like the past. But again, the problem is that you had to go to the past to determine that the future will be like the past, and that's a completely different question. And in fact, it's a circular argument to say that the future will be like the past because in the past, the future has been like the past. And the problem is there's no way to justify this simple problem of induction. And the problem with this is that if there's no logical reason, which Hume says there's no logical reason to think that the future will be like the past, if it's the case that this is a baseless assumption, then some devastating things follow, such as you can't do science, because science assumes at the most basic level that the future will be like the past. This is why experimentation means anything. And so this is a problem that Hume puts forward, and that later philosophers will look at. In our next lecture, we'll look at the philosopher Immanuel Kant. He looked at this problem, and he said that David Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumbers. And he has his own unique solution to this problem. I don't know if he necessarily solves the problem, but David Hume says that on his materialistic starting point, there is this problem of induction that is difficult to solve. Berkeley tries to solve it by being an idealist, and Hume's project is trying to solve a problem like this. He also has a question about causation, which is interesting and sometimes difficult to understand. So I've already mentioned this. So why would I believe in causation? Well, let's think of an example of playing pool. So when I hit the cue ball and the cue ball hits the 8 ball and the 8 ball goes in the pocket, it's a common sense intuition to say that the cue ball caused the 8 ball to move into the pocket. We believe in causation in that way. But if we look at the example again, we could ask ourselves, well, did you see the causal relationship between the objects? So you see event A happened, which is the cue ball moves, and then right after the cue ball moves, then you see event B, the 8 ball moves. But did you see the causal relationship between the two? Hume argues, no. Empirically, you did not see the causal relationship. You assumed that because event A happened, therefore event B happened, but you don't see the causal relationships between those events, and therefore we have no empirical grounds for grounding causation. That's something that we construct in our thinking of objects. It's the way that we interpret the world, but we don't see the causal relationships in and of themselves. So these types of problems that Hume is bringing up is what makes him a skeptic. So his empiricism is really a form of skepticism. And what he's really challenging here when he's challenging causation is Aquinas' common sense notion that every effect must have a cause. Hume would say, well, how do you know that? Have you ever experienced the fact that every effect must have a cause? Not only have you not experienced that, you don't even experience causation in and of itself. You infer causation from a series of events, but you don't see the causal relationships in themselves. And so this is one way that Hume is skeptical of many of the theistic arguments for God, because he doubts the notion of causation. And therefore, he goes on to say that many of these things that we call philosophy are really just metaphysical speculations. And so he famously writes, if we take into our hand any volume of divinity or school of metaphysics, let us ask this. Does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning number or quantity? This is what he actually considers tautologies. So he considers math to be an appropriate form of obtaining knowledge, because math is really just reasoning according to tautology. And so he says, no. Okay, does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact or existence? This is where sense experience comes in for him. So do you have any empirical evidence for this thing? If you don't, well then commit it to the flames, because it contains nothing but sophistry and illusion. So his skepticism really arises out of this epistemological starting point. You start with sense experience and tautologies, and if you can't justify your beliefs by appealing to sense experience and tautologies, then you ought not to believe it. So you can't ground induction in sense experience or a tautology, and you can't ground causation in sense experience or a tautology, and therefore it's nothing but sophistry and an illusion. So those are the three kinds of empiricism that developed in Britain: direct realism, representationalism, and phenomenalism. And in the next lecture, we're going to be looking at the philosopher Immanuel Kant and look at how he responded to this empirical tradition.